Labour has been clear that if it wins power at the next election, it won't grant any new oil and gas licences. But what will they do about Rishi Sunak's decision to grant hundreds of new licences for North Sea exploration? Surely Labour would reverse those, given how disastrous the experts have said they'll be for the UK's green transition. And especially as the party has vocally opposed the granting of new oil and gas licences by Sunak. Well, Thangam Debonair is the shadow leader of the House, putting her in charge of preparing Labour's legislative agenda should the party come to power. That's a pretty big job. So if anyone would know the answer to that question, it's her. Well, here's what she had to say on Newsnight.
Ed Miliband said today, this drives a coach and horses through climate commitments. So if Labour were to win the election, will you revoke the licences?
Well, we will grant no new licences, Kirsty. I mean, obviously, oil and gas is going to play a part in our transition to a fully clean, green energy market. But we need to make sure that we're not going to grant any more. It's not okay. The world is on fire. We have all seen that this week. And Rishi Sunak is taking us backwards. We're sending very bad signals to business investors, sending bad signals to consumers who face higher and higher bills. And he's not dealing with the climate emergency as it really is.
So, in effect, what you're saying is you won't issue any new licenses, but actually it's job done because actually this government is doing that job for you. So you accept that any licenses in place when you come to office, and by then there'll be hundreds more licenses, you are actually agreeing to this fossil fuel strategy.
No, what we want to see is a doubling of onshore wind, a tripling of solar, a quadrupling of offshore wind, investment in tidal and wave, which are the great untapped sources of power that surround our island nation, and new nuclear. That is a radical and bold way of tackling climate change. What's more, it's the way that we're going to get those great jobs of the future, bring down people's bills, protect our energy security, and tackle climate change all at the same time.
But you're saying that if you come in, but can I just clarify this? Because what you're saying is, if you win the next election, you will not revoke these licenses. And so therefore, that production in the North Sea will go ahead for both gas and oil to the same extent that the Conservative government wants it to go ahead. So in a sense, you are pursuing exactly the same strategy.
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. I mean, absolutely yes. And obviously nothing says bold and radical action like studiously avoiding the quite simple question that is being asked of her, which makes me think that what Debonair is saying there is that when these new licenses are granted, there will be zero difference in what's happening in the North Sea after the next election, whether Labour or the Tories win. Makes you excited for the next election, huh? Mike, how do we apply pressure on the Labour Party to change their position on this?
I don't think we can, unfortunately. And I think, Debonair's response there is reflective of Labour's general approach to politics under Keir Starmer. They are unrelentingly unimaginative, the Labour Party at the moment. The line they've drawn between themselves and the Conservative Party is one of competence. So if you think about a lot of Labour's critiques of Conservative policy, whether it's migration, whether it's on the environment, a lot of it is about competence. The problem is it's not actually really clear what Labour's values are. And it's important as a party to build a consensus, to tell a story, to have these values, these core values and principles the voters can point to and say, these are these values and principles that are guiding what Labour do when it comes to policy on the environment, on climate change, on migration, on the cost of living. But that's really unclear for Labour, and that's partly because they've adopted this deliberate strategy of being so unimaginative and not trying to ruffle too many feathers, not trying to abolish too many of the Conservatives' policies, no matter how bad they are, whether it's a choose-child policy, whether it's, oil and gas related. They don't want to ruffle too many feathers. They just want to kind of coast to victory in the next general election as straightforwardly as possible. And then apparently when they get into power, they're going to become this kind of radical, transformative, progressive party. But I don't think you can all of a sudden just flip the switch overnight, enter government and enact all these kind of radical reforms. You need to build a consensus in the build up to an election. Our democracy, one of the most important parts of our democracy isn't just voting at the ballot box every 4 or 5 years. It's for deliberative parts that happen between elections. The parts where a party can change voters' minds on an issue, or can raise an issue on the agenda, or can take a progressive stance on an issue. That all happens in those periods in between elections. So actually, Labour are missing the chance here to take a bold stance on the environment, to speak about a green economy in bold terms, to take a firmer stance on the Conservatives' bad policies. They're missing the chance to do that here, especially because a green economy, will create jobs, and voters want this to happen. Voters want us to transition to a green economy. Voters want us to take the climate crisis very, very seriously. So I just don't quite understand Labour's strategy here. It is, as I mentioned earlier, just unrelentingly unimaginative, and it just feels a bit silly.
I think it's also not good for democracy to have a party misrepresent what their agenda is. If it is the case that secretly they're, these genius strategic radicals who are going to come into power and do so much more than they promised, it's not a good democratic precedent to have this mentality of, the electorate are too stupid or too unimaginative to come on board with our vision before we get elected. So what we'll do is we'll just pretend that we're something else and then switch it up when we get into power. That's not a good thing, although it is very much Keir Starmer's wheelhouse. What's happening right now is that the Labour Party are complicit in building the consensus for a Conservative agenda. And this is what really worries me. What worries me is that we might see, yes, a Labour victory, but a slim one because of that lack of vision, because of that lack of excitement. And then during a Labour government, concessions to the right being pushed around by the tabloid media because they failed to build that kind of collective power. They failed to have the public buy into the project, and so they can more easily fold to whatever the Murdoch press or the tabloid media are telling them to do, and then not really achieve much, appear incompetent, and then in 5 years, when the next election is up, they've paved the way conceptually and politically for an equally, or if not more, right-wing Conservative Party that has had 5 years to regroup itself and sort itself out and execute its incredibly right-wing and, frankly, when it comes to the climate, suicidal agenda. But now it can implement it effectively because it's not in a shambles. It's had 5 years to recoup itself. I think it was David Graeber who said that the British state is essentially the Conservative Party, but Labour's allowed in when the Conservatives need to regroup themselves. That's my worry. And that's what happens when you have a Labour Party that doesn't use the fact that enthusiasm and interest in the Conservative Party is at an all-time low to start to really advocate for a radical shift, especially because the moment calls for it, because we have until 2030 to put in the kind of policies that would bring us back from the climate brink. Arguably, I don't even know if we can do that at the moment. It's also worth mentioning, Thangam Debonair is the MP for Bristol West, but at the next election, we'll be fighting in a newly created Bristol Central seat, and that seat is the key target seat for the Green Party, who are hoping to elect party co-leader Carla Denyer as their second ever MP. So people in Bristol, the more you know, that's all I'll say.